Welcome to the True Crime Cult. Here's your leader of the True Crime Cult.
Thank you for that introduction. We're going to be getting into a couple of videos today by True Crime Design. One is about the staging of the crime scene, possibly, and the other is about what Maddie told Adam theory. Let's get into it, guys.
Why didn't Jack D, who lives so close, not call the family when the niece had already called? Good point.
I don't know. That's my. I've asked that from that's like, why didn't you call 911? Jack D has been dating this young woman since they were in middle school, and you're telling me his first call isn't too steep?
As close to the family as he was too. That was an issue for me.
And he knew about it. I mean, early on when he went to get the dog. So,
you want to be great? You need to sacrifice.
Sam Spade.
What a tough guy.
That is a very good question. Why didn't he call the parents? Why did he just call about the dog? Very, very interesting. I'm not sure that's Jack D. I don't know. Somebody tell me in the live chat or in the comment section.
Gonzalez's sister, Olivia, said that her sister's phone records show that she called a man named Jack Ducour several times on the night she was murdered. The call log has 6 calls between 2:26 a.m. and 2:44 a.m. to Ducour. Madison Mogan also called the same person 3 times between 2:44 a.m. and 2:52 a.m. The last call to the man on Gonzalez's phone was logged at 2:52 a.m.
One of the victim's ex-boyfriends named Jack has found himself under the microscope, but the victim's family says he has absolutely nothing to do with the gruesome slayings.
The family of slain college student Kaylee Gonzalez is coming to the defense of her ex-boyfriend. Kaylee recently broke up with Jack Ducour after dating him for 5 years. Her father, brother, and sister were asked about the relationship today on CNN.
He is not listed, notably, as someone who has been cleared in the investigation. To your knowledge, is that significant?
No, I don't personally think so, because I think that there's the entire rest of the world.
See, look at her brother. With that question, he nods his head yes.
And
he is not listed, notably, as someone who has been cleared in the investigation. To your knowledge, is that significant?
No, I don't personally think so, because I think that there's the entire rest of the world that's also not on that list of people who have been cleared.
Right. We're also aware of a male who Madison and Kaylee had called several times the morning of November 13th, and we do not suspect that individual.
Unanswered calls placed by Kaylee and Maddie's mother are not proof of life. A DoorDash order placed from Xana's phone is not proof of life. TikTok activity on Xana's phone is not proof of life. Their witness accounts are not credible. Time of death has not been proven.
I just feel like there's been a couple individuals that were cleared very fast. That may not, maybe should not have been. And yeah,
She had the strong alibi.
just really fast.
If you
Just
can
like,
dismiss,
an hour later, and we're like, what? And I don't know. I don't know anything about those individuals. I just know they were people that, definitely should have been looked at. And yeah.
I don't know what would prevent you from sharing somebody's alibi.
So just so I understand this correctly, your daughter is stating that the night of the incident, that her friend that had this information that told her about this, and her friend's boyfriend who attends the University of Idaho, claimed to have stayed at your daughter's house.
Correct.
But you were there and you didn't see them.
And I didn't see him, and that did not set well. So what my understanding was that my daughter's sorority sister was at the house at some point, but the boyfriend was not at the house, which I learned after pulling it out of her teeth, and that two of the kids involved who were looked at closely he was their ally. And he went to fast food, and then he went to their house, said they played video games all night. Then he left it, he said 7:30 or 8, and then went back and got his girlfriend from Pullman. And
That's
so, right. And so I think, so that 7:30 to 8:30 time frame, that's, and she went back there. She left with him, is my understanding, was what I was told. I think the sorority sister might have stayed at my daughter's house or not, but knew at 8:30, and there was a narrative discovered and built, and so I called the FBI back because I called them all the time, and they said, we've discovered several lies in the alibis. And that's what their exact words to me were. They've discovered several lies in the alibis. So I believe that they believe whatever.
Did you hear that? They discovered several lies in the alibis.
And so I called the FBI back because I called them all the time, and they said, we've discovered several lies in the alibis. And that's what their exact words to me were. They've discovered several lies in the alibis. So I believe that they believe whatever has been told, because the defense's investigator has called me and asked for confirmation, and I'll confirm with anybody. I don't know what he did, if he did or not. I'm not saying I don't know. I do not know. Just want the right person to go down for it, because these kids go back to school in 3 weeks. So that's all I can tell you at this point about the alibi, is that the alibi, according to what I knew as their alibi, does not wash. When that tape came out about Adam, I told Adam everything. My question, of course, was then to the kids, what did she tell Adam? And then somehow, and I do know it was about drugs, and it was involved with throwing drugs away. I know that the students knew they were going to be shaken down. That I know, for the drugs being missing or the money being missing. I know that. The kids all know that, but they didn't expect them to be killed. I don't think anybody expected them to be killed.
So I told Adam everything. I think it has to do with they threw away drugs. I mean, Maddie was done with it and threw away whatever it was that needed to be thrown away. I don't know what it was, but I believe it was thrown away in a garbage can next door. And I think the girls were waiting until they were both done to report to the police, or maybe what they had learned.
Yeah.
And I think she maybe told Adam that, not realizing Adam would tell somebody else.
So Adam sold him out. Quite possibly, Adam sold them out.
Adam and Jack were roommates, folks. So understand that there's a very great possibility that's what was passed along in that sense. So
that's my understanding of what occurred.
Right, and this is all very speculative theory, folks. Don't take any of this.
And the FBI has that, and so does the defense. I've told the defense called me when they called me. They asked me questions about that, and I told the FBI that immediately too.
Right. And also in that same walk conversation that was recorded, Jack Showalter says something to Maddie that nobody can clearly verify what it was.
I think he was warning. He said, you better be careful, Maddie. They're gonna get you.
That's a good point.
Unless it was a purposeful leak. Maybe somebody leaked it on purpose.
On purpose
I
to
don't
make
know.
a point. Yeah. That and
Or
and I
to
don't
get information out of people.
That's
I
another
don't know.
point. Yeah. I don't, like I said, nothing.
Did Jack D and Steve give each other? Do you guys think Steve knows something? Look at that look Jack is giving. Just to Steve. Look at that look. I wonder what Steve is thinking when he's looking at Jack. What do you think they're thinking?
You're all in danger until you decide to say what you know. It doesn't matter. Facing this now is eventually it will come out. Face it now together as a group before somebody else dies. Before you're going to more funerals.
I started at Purdue Global because it was really easy to try to balance classes, writing paper.
So, guys, what do you think Jack D knew? Seriously. Do you think Jack D knew? And just like they said, the FBI knows that parts of the alibi was a lie.
You two folks to do is take those cleaning products and clean the inside of the car. I'm talking fast, fast, fast. You need to go in the back seat, scoop up all those little pieces of brain and skull. Get it out of there. Boys, get to work.
Please would be nice.
Come again?
I said a please would be nice.
Get it straight, Buster. I'm not here to say please. I'm here to tell you what to do. And if self-preservation is an instinct you possess, you better fucking do it and do it quick.
She didn't call the police, but it raises a question as what was happening in that period of time.
There's quite a bit of blood in the apartment, and it's a pretty traumatic scene to find 4 dead college students in a residence.
The Latah County coroner is commenting, saying the scene she saw on Sunday was
The kids on
gruesome.
the first floor, what did they see? How much of the room did they see? Why did they say unconscious as opposed to dead when there was blood running out of the house onto the outside of the house? And Where did they get this unconscious from? Why are they saying that? Are there footprints in the bedroom on the second and third floor? If there was so much blood, then what you've got is a killer who certainly is stepping in the blood as he's killing these kids. But in addition to that, you've got the other two kids. You've got to eliminate their footprints. Then you've got the local police responding to unconscious. I guarantee you they didn't have any kind of slip. Then the question is, the forensic evaluation that you have, the crime scene was contaminated. We don't know if it's his or hers or 8 other people.
Horrific and a very large-scale crime scene, because you're going to be dealing with a number of different floors that need to be processed, the bedrooms where the crimes actually occurred, and then ingress and egress points. How did the alleged killer get inside the house?
From the 8-hour timeline gap to the surprising lack of physical evidence recovered from the scene, there's definitely reason to at least question whether the King Road residence was cleaned up in some capacity after it became a crime scene. To that end, is it likely that Brian aided in the cleanup, putting his knowledge of criminal investigations to use to mislead and thwart investigators? Did he have accomplices on the inside? Or are these possible cleanup efforts on the part of the roommates motivated purely by self-preservation concerning illicit activities that could have been going on inside the residence at 1122 King Road? We've heard this crime scene described as complex. The coroner described the scene as traumatic and bloody. First responders commented on the overwhelming smell of blood upon entering the residence. Maddie and Kaylee were found in.
See, now here's the thing. If there was such an overwhelming smell of blood, why did the roommates wait 8 hours to call? And don't give me this whole frozen shock phase bullshit. If the smell of blood was that bad in the house, why would they lock their doors to their rooms and stay in their damn rooms?
In a single bed on the 3rd floor with stab wounds. Xana was found laying on the floor with wounds which appeared to have been caused by a sharp-edged weapon, and Ethan was found with wounds later determined to be caused by sharp force injuries. We also know that there was something about this crime scene that immediately gave investigators the feeling that this was not a random attack, leading them to declare that the community at large was not at risk.
Art Betke, the mayor of Moscow, says he's hearing from police it's complicated.
Because at this point, with a case of this magnitude, you do not want to mess things up. Earlier today, the Idaho State Patrol was contemplating bringing in a mobile lab to assist in the processing of a rather complex scene.
Tonight, he says they're waiting for confirmation from the coroner's office on the cause of death, but there's no threat to the public.
Looking around, looking at the timeline when things happened, it turns out that this is a one-time event at one particular location. This does not carry on to the larger community.
Recordings just.
I'm sorry. Bullshit, it don't. Why did they tell the residents to shelter in place?
Got better. Hey, it's Dana from StreamYard. I'm so excited to announce that local.
So when I hear complex crime scene, the first thing that comes to mind for me is staging. Staging is a conscious criminal action on the part of an offender to thwart an investigation. This involves altering the scene to try to disguise what really happened. When reconstructing the crime scene, the investigating team must always be on the lookout for staging. Typically, evidence or bodies will be moved, or there will be signs of a break-in that did not actually happen. A murderer may move a body into the bathroom and pretend the victim fell when he or she got out of the bath or shower. Removing bloodstains with a cleanser like bleach is also not uncommon. However, invisible traces often remain, which can be subjective to forensic analysis. In this case, the timeline of events and specifically when investigators believe the murders happened are based on the statements of Dylan Mortensen, the phone records of Dylan and Bethany, and the video of the white Elantra.
It's 4 a.m. According to the affidavit, Zana receives a DoorDash delivery. And a source tells ABC News that the delivery is contactless and the order is left at the front door. A surviving roommate would later tell authorities that around this time, 4 a.m., she wakes up to what sounds like Kaylee playing with her dog in the room on the third floor. She also reports hearing someone say, "There's someone here." 4:04 a.m., authorities say the white sedan is seen driving into the neighborhood a fourth time. 4:12 a.m., according to phone records obtained by police, Zana is awake and using TikTok. The affidavit states that the same surviving roommate says she hears what sounds like crying coming from Zana's room. She opens her door a second time and says she hears a male voice say something to the effect of, "It's okay, I'm going to help you." At 4:17 a.m., this security camera on a neighbor's home picks up distorted audio of what sounds like voices or a whimper, followed by a loud thud. A dog can also be heard barking numerous times. This camera is less than 50 feet from Zana's bedroom. The affidavit states the surviving roommate then opens her door a third time. She sees a masked man walking past her towards the sliding glass door in the kitchen. In frozen shock, she locks her door. 4:20 a.m., police say the white sedan is seen leaving the neighborhood at a high rate speed.
But what if she's lying and the white Elantra was simply leaving the scene to dispose of evidence before returning once again around 9 a.m.? What if the DoorDash delivery was staged? Was that really Xana on TikTok or someone using her phone? All of these suspect descriptions and reports of specific words and phrases that Dylan allegedly heard, it all just kind of sounds very made up to me. And it has me wondering how true these accounts are and if the time of death was actually as early as 2 a.m. I say this because this crime seems to have all the markings of a crime of passion, which typically involve excessive violence like multiple stabbings or gunshots. Most burglars, on the other hand, are opportunists and will kill only if they panic. Such murders will generally not be as violent as those where anger against the victim is the motive. When a victim has died in a violent manner and it looks as if the motive is burglary, the investigator must always consider the possibility that staging has taken place. Is it possible that perhaps when Maddie and Kaylee got home at around 1:56, there was an argument or an altercation between the victims, the roommates, and possibly others who may have been there or who may have showed up to the house? Was the narrative of the 4 a.m. intruder then created to cover up the altercation? It's definitely possible. But let's talk about forensics. The PCA gave us two key pieces of forensic evidence. One was the K-bar sheath with the DNA on the button buckle that was connected to Koberger via his dad's trash, and two was the latent footprint just outside Dylan's door. Regarding the sheath, I'm comfortable saying that I believe it was purposefully planted at the scene in an attempt to mislead investigators and or possibly intended to be a calling card of some sort. This is just based on its positioning on the bed next to a victim. It just seems too curated for me rather than something.
Very good point. It could have been planted.
That may have flown off his person in a scuffle or something like that. It also seems like a major leap that he would accidentally leave it at the crime scene in that manner, given the reported planning and his knowledge of criminology. If he did leave the sheath by accident, he had every opportunity to recover it, including his visit back to the crime scene around 9 a.m. It's also possible that he went back to the crime scene at 9 a.m. and staged the sheath at that point after getting rid of maybe the actual murder weapon when he was south of Moscow on his way back to Pullman. It should be noted that we don't actually know what the murder weapon is or how many there may be. Now, a K-bar is a decent sized knife, and it's definitely an efficient killing instrument with a blade measuring at 7 inches. For reference, most chef's knives typically measure around 8 inches. So it's not the only big knife that may have been available at the house that could have done this kind of damage. Just saying. And with regards to the latent shoe print, this print would not be visible to the naked eye. Investigators located the print during the second processing of the crime scene by ISP forensic team. by first using a presumptive blood test and then aminoblack, a protein stain that detects the presence of cellular material. The detected shoe print showed a diamond-shaped pattern similar to the pattern of a Vans type shoe sole just outside the door of Dylan's room, located on the second floor. Note, it does not state what relevant size this shoe print is.
Okay. This advanced shoe. How it come? When they arrested Koberger, he was wearing New Balances. And all of the shoes that they collected at his apartment were New Balances. Not one Vans shoe in Koberger's collection of shoes at his house, at his apartment in Pullman, or at his parents' house. The shoes that he was wearing when he was arrested were New Balances.
So it really could be anybody's shoe print. If this latent print is the only type of footprint on scene, this could suggest possible crime scene cleaning because it's highly unlikely that the suspect would be able to escape the scene without tracking blood throughout the house. And if someone did potentially make an attempt at cleanup, they wouldn't have been able to detect this latent print. And the last point I really want to make here with regards to the forensics is that there really wasn't that much physical evidence that was collected from the scene, despite the contained indoor crime scene with multiple areas of interest. 113 pieces of physical evidence seems like a lot, but when we're talking about 4 victims and a fairly gruesome scene, it really isn't a lot. To put it into perspective, and this isn't a perfect analysis at all, but divide 113 by 4, that's only 28 pieces of evidence, physical evidence per victim, which seems a bit thin to me when we're talking about hairs, fibers, bloodstains, etc.
Let me show you how we do stuff around here. Actually, my department uses mandate.com, so I'm good.
Cases that I've covered with all of the different evidence that's entered in a court of law. This particular crime is going to have multiple locations. Let's just start with the inside of the house. I mean, don't get me started. There's 2 bedrooms at least. There's the entrance point, and there's whatever was tracked, and there's all the different hair, fiber, fingerprints that anybody has left behind that needs to be excluded. That's a lot in a house like that. It's not a single family home. There's lots of boyfriends and girlfriends and friends and former tenants, etc. Then there's the outside of the house, wherever that killer left, and whatever footprints, shoe prints, whatever trail of anything he or she may have left. Then there are all 3 floors. Then there are 6 cars, presumably each roommate might have had a car. Maybe Ethan had one too. It sounds like a lot of places where a lot of things have to be looked at. And so that's why I sort of thought 113, but this isn't my expertise, it's yours.
Right. So, and I appreciate that, but you have to think about it. These investigators, I'm sure they've started to vet those locations. Maybe there are certain locations where there was not any evidence that was found. Maybe not inside of the vehicles, or maybe not. You didn't find any evidence at the bar. Physical evidence that needed to be collected and tested. That's what I mean. So you know, you never can tell. I would hope that they have collected as much evidence as possible, because look, 113, you want to see as much evidence as possible in a case like this. But if 113 is the number that they have, then that's what they have.
So I hope this gave you something to think about with regards to what forensic evidence we actually do have. While there are so many unknowns, we do have some facts to work with, and they're just really kind of confusing in nature and not really as conclusive as we'd like them to be. But I do want to leave you with this point, and it's that the most, quote, logical explanation or Occam's razor scenario doesn't take into account deception and intentional efforts to thwart and contaminate. When a crime scene has been tampered with, it is imperative that investigators identify these attempts immediately so they can accurately understand what happened. incel theory and an obsession that developed on social media and maybe even in real life, there are still so many questions that remain unanswered in this scenario. For me, it all comes down to that 8 hours, the failure to call 911 right away, no forced entry, and the two unharmed survivors, and what impact all of this has on the crime scene and the physical evidence. The scene was undoubtedly interfered with, but was this intentional crime scene staging or unintentional contamination?
Business owner, then animated explainer videos are the best way to capture attention, get more followers.
So what do you guys think? Do you think the crime scene could have been staged, or do you think it was just badly contaminated?
Autopsies on the 4 students found each had multiple stab wounds. Some had defensive wounds, showing they fought with the attacker, and there was no sexual assault. County Coroner Kathy Mabbutt is describing the murders as personal.
Were they found in beds?
Yes, there were multiple stab wounds. The fatal ones were to the chest area or the upper body area.
So Kaylee's injuries were significantly more brutal, but they were sleeping together in Maddie's room. So that helps put the puzzle together.
The father of Xana Kernodle says her wounds show she fought for her life.
Bruises and just, maybe hurt by the knife or whatever. She's a tough kid. Whatever she wanted to do, she could do it.
Ethan was stayed the night at his girlfriend's house, who was one of 5 girls who lived in the home.
They say his girlfriend, Xana Kernodle, was one of the other victims and that they were in the same room in the house.
From a forensic perspective, traumatic injuries can be divided into 2 categories: blunt trauma and sharp force trauma. Blunt trauma results from an impact with a dull, firm surface or object. Blunt trauma is typically caused by contact with a solid, firm surface, such as the floor or ground, or an object like a fist, bat, or bottle. Blunt trauma injuries include abrasions, bruises, contusions, hematomas, avulsions, fractures, and lacerations. Sharp force trauma describes an injury produced by an instrument with a thin edge or point, i.e. sharp cutting instruments. Sharp force injuries include stab wounds, incised wounds, and chop wounds. So this term, sharp force injury, encompasses essentially these 3 separate but related injury types. Stab wounds or puncture wounds are produced by sharp pointed objects, wherein the direction of force is more perpendicular to the skin surface as opposed to tangential or parallel. In most instances, the wound is deeper than it is long on the skin surface. In contrast, incised wounds or cut wounds are produced by sharp-edged objects, wherein the direction of force is more tangential or parallel to the skin surface as opposed to perpendicular. In most circumstances, the wound is longer on the skin surface than it is deep. Chop wounds can be considered a combination of sharp and blunt force trauma, wherein a relatively bulky object with an edge or a fast-moving object with an edge impacts the body, resulting in injuries that have features of sharp force trauma as well as those of blunt force trauma. Sharp force wound edges are characteristically sharp, clean, unbruised, unabraded, and inverted. There is no tissue bridging, and the injuries tend to be more linear. The deeper tissues are cut cleanly in the same plane. Most fatalities caused by sharp force are homicides. The most frequent cause of death in homicides caused by sharp force is exsanguination because of injuries to major vessels. How fast death will occur depends on the number of vascular hits, the type of vessels affected, and their size. In this context, not only the amount of blood loss, but also the
speed of blood loss is a deciding factor. As one might guess, the scene of death in cases due to sharp force injury are frequently extremely bloody, although this is not always the case. Oftentimes, when skin injuries are gaping open, blood freely flows out of the body, resulting in extensive external blood loss. This may be particularly evident in cases with large, gaping, incised wounds. In contrast, in some cases with sharp force injuries, particularly stab wounds, the wound edges remain relatively well approximated and there is extensive internal bleeding but little external blood.
Okay, I'm sorry. I got to dispute what the coroner said. How can they be all be asleep in their fucking beds, but yet there is blood seeping from Xana's room onto the foundation of the house? I'm sorry, if you're asleep in your bed, that doesn't happen. The only way that would happen is if she was killed near the wall or floor. Because if you're laying in your bed and you're stabbed to death, the blood will seep into your mattress, not seep down the side of the wall onto the foundation of the house. So I'm sorry, Miss Coroner. I gotta dispute your claim about them being asleep in their beds at the time of the murder, because the blood soaked foundation of the house proves you wrong.
And welcome to this Thursday edition of Banfield. I want to begin with some breaking news on the Idaho murder case. A couple of sources with knowledge of the investigation have told News Nation some details that up until now we did not know. Let me lay a few of these details out, but I do want to warn you that this is graphic information and it is uncomfortable to hear this because we're talking about innocent kids who were killed in that home back in October. And not only that, this is evidence that likely will come out in court at some point. Whether it will be germane to who the killer is or not, that remains to be seen. But it could be evidence nonetheless. With that in mind, let me let you know what these sources have told News Nation. Number one, they told us that the victims, Kaylee Gonzalez and Madison Mogan, were killed first, and they confirmed that Ethan Chapin and Xana Kernodle were killed on the second floor afterwards. And these are some of the other details that they have released. They said that Ethan Chapin was killed in the doorway of Xana Kernodle's room before the killer set upon Xana. The sources say that it appeared Ethan had stepped partly into the hallway where the attack may have begun. These sources also say that Ethan Chapin suffered a slash to the neck. But I have to say that both of these details are in direct conflict with what the coroner had originally told us right here on this program exclusively. And also, they conflict directly with what police have said as well. And those two facts that are in conflict are that all of the victims were in their beds, according to police and the coroner. And according to the coroner, all of the injuries were stab wounds and not slash wounds. So I just want to play for you exactly what it was the coroner said in her words.
Don't believe the mainstream media hype.
You want to be great? You need to sacrifice.
Do you see that?
Were any of them slashed? Were any of their necks cut? Or were these all puncture wounds?
Well, it was a pretty large knife, so it's really hard to call them puncture wounds, and they were definitely stabbings.
Can you tell me, when you say that they might have been sleeping, were they found in beds?
Yes.
So those were the facts that the coroner told us. And like I said, it is in direct conflict with what these two sources familiar with the investigation are now telling us as well. That obviously needs to be sorted out and likely best in a court of law as well. Also want to tell you these other details that we have learned from these two sources, that Xana Kernodle put up a fierce fight when the attacker set upon her, repeatedly grabbing the attacker's knife, so much so that she sustained deep cuts to her fingers and that her fingers were nearly severed. Now, that does actually work in comport with what Xana's father had reported to an Arizona news outlet about what he knew.
Father of Xana Kernodle says her wounds show she fought for her life.
Bruises and just, maybe hurt by the knife or whatever. She's a tough kid. Whatever she wanted to do, she could do it.
Joseph Scott Morgan, I was trying to be as tender as possible with the coroner in asking the nature of this is before we ever knew anything about the nature of the stabbings. And I asked if any of the victims had been slashed. And she seemed to be very clear that these were all stab wounds. But these sources are saying that, Ethan had been slashed, that his neck had been slashed, and that was the original injury he received. I guess the same question for you. Can those two things still be true? Can a coroner consider a slash a stab?
If her assessment was made merely by what she saw at the scene, I'd say, yeah, they could be true. Those two things could be true.
Well, I'll stop you right there. I asked her that. I said, were you present for the autopsies? And she said, yes.
No, I said at the scene. If she made that assessment at the scene, just to be very blunt with you, these injuries are going to be encrusted with blood. It's hard to make that assessment at the scene. However, if she went to the post, this would have been easily visualized at that point in time. And not only is the injury to the neck a slash, allegedly, according to this person, but these injuries that you're talking about on the hands, these are going to be incised wounds as well, not necessarily slashes, but this is as a result of grabbing hold of the blade and pulling it through the hand. These are not stab wounds. I can tell you that definitively based upon my experience. So yeah, there probably are some stab wounds, but that information is, you need more clarity here as to what she's saying. And that's, I guess at the end of the day, it's not really the point. I would draw.
The clarity is that the coroner don't know what the fuck she's talking about.
To question what kind of exam was conducted on site at the scene. I've always wondered, when did she actually get access to the bodies, and how much exposure did she have to the remains that she would have had to have traveled to Spokane to view those posts, because that's where they were done.
Okay, so there's obviously a lot to unpack here. And of course, we're not going to take this information as fact because it's an unnamed source. Just because News Nation platforms it does not mean it's necessarily credible information. That being said, though, I think it would be negligent to just ignore and dismiss this information as speculation. I think it's worth considering and seeing if we can corroborate some of the things that are being reported here. So this first claim that Maddie and Kaylee were killed first seems to check out, at least to me, just based on a number of different items, such as the fact that the sheath was found next to Maddie, whether it was planted or not, the scene upstairs being more controlled and less chaotic, I guess you could say, as the scene downstairs. And when I say downstairs, I mean the second floor. And not only that, but the charging documents, which list Maddie as the first murder victim and Kaylee as the second murder victim. It then lists the charge for Xana and then Ethan. So, no, that's not necessarily conclusive evidence as to the order in which they were murdered. It does make sense that the affidavit would be drafted in that manner, with the burglary first and then the order in which the victims died, or that prosecutors believe they died. But again, not a confirmed fact, just something to keep in mind as we make these deductions. With that being said, I've seen it reported a lot, and I think the common opinion or narrative is that Maddie and Kaylee went to sleep in the same bed, which is Maddie's tiny little twin bed tucked up against the wall, which to me just does not make a lot of sense. And I don't think there's anything weird about sleeping in the same bed as your best friend. That's not what I'm getting at. It's the fact that Kaylee's room was right there with a normal size bed, that if they wanted to sleep in the same bed, it would make a lot more sense to me that they would choose to sleep in Kaylee's room. Not only that, but Murphy was in Kaylee's room. There's no, I guess, factual evidence that they went to sleep in the same bed. Nobody's testifying that they went to sleep in the same bed. We saw Brian Enton from News Nation got this piece of information from Steve Gonsalves, which was a credible piece of information that they were found in the same bed. But he did interpret that to mean that they went to sleep in the same bed.
We confirmed that they were in Maddie's room, which is also interesting. That's something that we did not know. So Kaylee's injuries were significantly more brutal, but they were sleeping together in Maddie's room. They were sleeping together in Maddie's room,
which is a huge logical leap, in my opinion. I don't think you can state that someone was killed where they were found, and that will continue to come up as we talk about the crime scene.
Did you guys see that?
They were sleeping together in Maddie's room. They were sleeping together in Maddie's room,
which is,
look how tiny her room is. Christy was right. That is a tiny, tiny room.
A huge logical leap, in my opinion. I don't think you can state that someone was killed where they were found, and that will continue to come up as we talk about the crime scene on the second floor. But I do want to take a minute and discuss Maddie and Kaylee's wounds. These wounds are very different than the victims on the second floor's wounds. And this is so critical. And I don't see a lot of people talking about this. Maddie and Kaylee, per the affidavit, are the only two that were found with visible stab wounds. Unless that information was left out of the affidavit, which I don't see why it would be, these are different injury patterns. These could be different perpetrators. These could be different weapons. And we'll get to that when I go into Xana and Ethan. But I want to make it clear that the stab wounds are upstairs. Perhaps Maddie was attacked in her sleep, not giving her the opportunity to respond or engage in any sort of scuffle. And Kaylee may have entered the scene to figure out what was going on. And then she endured a beating of some sort. And that would explain why her injuries are more severe. Of course, that's just speculation. But there's also this statement from Mr. Gonsalves. He says about Maddie and Kaylee, they may have individually died from the exact same thing, being stabbed, but there are more details, he said. They're not even close to matching. This is about Maddie and Kaylee. So it's possible that just based on this information, the very limited information that we have, it's definitely possible that Kaylee sustained more stab wounds and perhaps deeper stab wounds and possibly a beating as well, just based on the limited information we have. But the point I really want to drive home here is Maddie and Kaylee are the only two with stab wounds per the affidavit. So moving on to the claims made about Xana's defensive injuries, this source specifically claims that she put up a, quote, fierce fight and sustained severe injuries to her hands, including her fingers being almost severed as a result of trying to grab the attacker's knife. Definitely disturbing and harrowing if true. And I am inclined to believe that there is merit to this claim as well, based on the words of her father, as well as Steve Gonsalves, who stated that the coroner told him that Kernodle had defensive wounds after trying to fight off her killer. And he further stated that it was a hell of a battle going on down there, which does support the claims about
defensive wounds and putting up a fierce fight. This claim also lines up with the injuries that were briefly described in the affidavit, which state that, quote, Kernodle was deceased with wounds which appeared to have been caused by an edged weapon, end quote. This is very important. Xana's wounds, as described in the affidavit, are not stab or puncture wounds like Maddie and Kaylee's injuries. Incised wounds are produced by sharp-edged objects and typically result in gaping wounds, resulting in extensive external blood loss. And adding in the information from the coroner that the fatal injuries were to the upper body, I think it's reasonable to deduce that Xana died of an incised wound to the throat and unfortunately bled out on the floor. As we look into the claims about Ethan, though, this is where it gets a bit more complex. First, let's start with the injuries. This new claim states that Ethan allegedly suffered a slash to the neck. So first of all, I think a lot of this miscommunication and confusion can be credited to a lack of understanding of the proper terminology for the injuries, as the coroner seems to think that any wound caused by a knife is a stab wound, which is just not the case. And terminology and word choice is critical when it comes to charging documents and other important evidentiary documents and even extrajudicial statements from key figures in the case, like the coroner. And that's probably a big reason that there was a gag order issued in this case in the first place. But what can we gain from the word choice, specifically regarding Ethan's injuries as described briefly in the PCA? Quote, Chapin was also deceased with wounds later determined to be caused by sharp force injuries, end quote. Sharp force injuries, as we've discussed, encompasses all three of these wounds: stab, incised, and chop wounds. The affidavit states that Gonsalves and Mogan had visible stab wounds, so their injuries are not in dispute. And we surmised with a reasonable degree of certainty that Xana's wounds are likely predominantly incised wounds, both the defensive wounds on her hands and the probable fatal wound that I speculated would be a throat wound. It's possible that Xana also may have had stab wounds and this information was not included for whatever reason. Maybe it wasn't visible upon entering the scene, as the affidavit is written from the point of view of Corporal Brett Payne. And it's possible that the wounds may more closely resemble each other on autopsy when they're cleaned up. But we're working with the information we've been given, so I'm comfortable saying that Maddie and Kaylee died of stab wounds and Xana's wounds were cut, slash, incised, whatever you want to call it. So if Ethan was killed with an incised wound to the neck, I would expect the affidavit to read that he was found with wounds which appeared to be caused by an edge weapon, as this would describe what is presuming to be both his wounds and Xana's wounds. So the differentiation in the language there is interesting to me. And instead of using that sharp edge weapon terminology, the affiant chooses to introduce this term, sharp force injuries, when referring to Ethan's injuries, even though we know that they all died of sharp force injuries. A stab wound is a sharp force injury. An incised wound is a sharp force injury. So why does he choose to refer to Ethan's wounds like this? Well, he knows the public is going to read the affidavit and dissect it, and the media is going to sensationalize it. So I think part of this is to exclude some gruesome details from public record, and this is pretty normal in a high-profile case. But it definitely has me wondering if Ethan's injuries could not be classified as stab or incised. And that leads me to speculate that he might have died by chop wounds. So let's go over that a little bit. So as we discussed, a chop wound is best considered a combined blunt and sharp force injury that is produced by a relatively sharp object wielded with a tremendous amount of force. The object is often heavy and moving at a high rate of speed, or with significant angular acceleration. Because of the larger amount of force,
Machete, possibly?
Chop wounds have features of both sharp and blunt force injuries. As such, chop wounds frequently have marginal abrasions and contusions, and sometimes lacerations. Examples of objects
that can cause chop wounds include crowbars, claw hammers, tomahawks, axes, hatchets, boat propellers, lawnmower blades, and a multitude of industrial and farm machinery. And this is speculation. I want to make that very, very clear. I'm reading into this affidavit perhaps a bit too much, but there is a discrepancy with how these wounds are being described in the legal document. So I'm addressing that. I'm wondering if these wounds that Ethan sustained are chop wounds, and that's why there's a bit more secrecy surrounding his specific injuries. And being the only male victim, it would make sense that he was perhaps incapacitated with a heavier, duller object than a knife. And if that's the case, then we have a new weapon we're introducing into the scene. So that also may be a reason why they kept that pretty vague within the charging document. So as I'm going through all of this, I remembered a post that Ethan's mom, Stacy Chapin, made on Facebook on January 11th. And it mentions that for an update, anything we/Ethan had is now frozen with the defense. For us, it involves 2 vehicles, E's belongings, and a nice set of golf clubs. So why were golf clubs taken as evidence? So then I asked myself, is a golf club capable of producing sharp force injuries? And I immediately thought of the infamous case of Martha Moxley, who was a 15-year-old girl who was murdered in 1975 in Greenwich, Connecticut. Martha was found beaten and stabbed to death in the backyard of her family's Greenwich, Connecticut home. Investigators traced a trail of blood to the Moxley driveway. There, investigators discovered a piece of the murder weapon, the shaft of a 6-iron golf club, while one man and her neighbor and Kennedy cousin, Michael Skakel, who was also 15 at the time, was eventually arrested, tried, and convicted of her murder. His conviction was later overturned. Martha Moxley had been beaten and stabbed with a Tony Pena golf club. The golf club she was struck with shattered from the force of the blows. But listen to the way these injuries are described. Dr. Henry Lee testified, using his right arm in a chopping motion, Dr. Lee demonstrated how the murderer most likely stood over the victim, repeatedly hitting her with the club. She was probably on the ground receiving some injury, he said. As the killer swung the club back, it had finally broken apart, and the bloodied metal head and 2 sections of the shaft flew more than 100 feet, coming to a rest among dead leaves across the yard. Also, Connecticut Chief Medical Examiner Wayne Carver directed the jury's attention to deep wounds in the girl's head. They were, Carver said, produced by the Tony Pena 6-iron that police say came from a set of clubs owned by the defendant's mother. Carver said the great force of the blows pierced the girl's skull and brain, and that one blow was so sharp and piercing, virtually a stab, that it dragged a lock of her hair through one side of her neck and out the other. As many as 9 blows may have been delivered, said Carver. The assumption I am making, he announced, is that only 1 club was used. So even though her cause of death back in 75 was considered blunt force trauma, I think it's clear that these are sharp force injuries, specifically chop wounds, which does include characteristics of blunt force trauma. But clearly these wounds have characteristics of sharp force injuries. So objects that are used to
So why did Ethan have 2 vehicles that's being held by the defense?
produce chop wounds are typically a heavy or a powerful object that is somewhat sharp to very sharp, or by a sharp object wielded with a tremendous amount of force. The edge of the object creates a sharp force injury, characterized by cutting of the skin and underlying tissues, whereas the intensity of the force or the relative bluntness of the object results in associated abrasions, lacerations, or contusions with or without underlying fractures. A chop wound's appearance may also aid in determining the type of weapon used, as the wounds may take on the pattern of the weapon. So if Ethan's injuries do have elements of blunt trauma, that would make them unique from the other 3 victims. And it would definitely introduce the possibility of 2 separate offenders, 2 separate weapons. This could even be 3 separate weapons used in this attack. Possibly the same weapon upstairs on Maddie and Kaylee. Could be a different knife on Xana if the golf club was
at the scene could have been grabbed in a scuffle or a panic by the offender, or it could have even been grabbed by the victim in an attempt to confront the intruder, right? That could be an object that he grabbed, and then he could have become overpowered in a scuffle, perhaps in the hallway, as suggested by the source. Maybe not. But if he was overpowered, say by two males, one of them could have grabbed the golf club and beat him to death with it. Not to be graphic, but that's a possible.
Here's the thing, though. They were on the second floor. His golf clubs were on the first floor in the storage room. So how could he go down to the first floor and grab his golf clubs if he was already on the second floor and they were one floor below?
Scenario that could have happened. This is just something to think about with regards to these injuries. I think it's very these new claims have to do with these.
Do you see how small Xana's bedroom was?
Grabbed the golf club and beat him to death with it. Not to be graphic, but that's a possible scenario that could have happened. This is just something to think about with regards to these injuries. I think it's very interesting, and I think there's a reason we don't have more information on Ethan's injuries. So these new claims have to
look how small that bedroom is. Like the bed could barely fit in it.
Do with these schematics and locations of the murders. They claim that Ethan was confronted, or an altercation began in the hallway where he may have been overpowered, killed, and then the attacker or attackers turned their attention to Xana. And that makes sense to me. I don't have any evidence to combat that. The one thing that bothers me is the charging documents, and I know that that's not fact, but I don't know. It's just something that sticks with me, because originally I did guess that order, that Xana was last, just based on her having defensive wounds and having to fight. But when I first heard these claims, I got real heated and, kind of like Ashley Banfield, I'm like, wait a minute, this doesn't line up with what we've been told. This doesn't line up with even the affidavit, because the affidavit says, quote, just before this room, which is Xana's room, there was a bathroom door on the south wall of the hallway. As I approached this room, I could see a body, later identified as Kernodle's, laying on the floor. Kernodle was deceased with wounds which appeared to have been caused by an edged weapon. Also in the room was a male, later identified as Ethan Chapin. So because Corporal Payne first came across Xana's body, I'm like, no way Ethan was in the hallway, because he would have seen Ethan's body first. And it does say also in the room. Ethan's body was in the room. And it's presumed that Xana's was too, but just perhaps closer to the hallway than Ethan's was. And then you have the statement from the coroner who says that they were all in beds. And I'm like, what the hell? None of this makes sense. Until I rewatched the segment and pay very close attention to what's being said.
The other details that they have released. They said that Ethan Chapin was killed in the doorway of Xana Kernodle's room before the killer set upon Xana. The sources say that it appeared Ethan had stepped partly into the hallway where the attack may have begun.
And compare that with what the coroner stated.
They might have been sleeping. Were they found in beds?
Yes.
You don't have to be at a point in your life where you feel like you're hanging on by a thread to go and speak with a therapist. As a licensed therapist.
So these news sources aren't saying that Ethan was found in the hallway. They're simply claiming that an altercation started in the hallway and he was maybe killed in the hallway. Again, there's that presumption that you have to be found in the same location that you're killed. And as we covered in my previous video, crime scene staging and cleanup is a thing. If somebody wanted to make this look like a random intruder attack, as we've been led to believe, We have to consider the possibility that the bodies were moved. We know that Xana was at least discovered by Corporal Payne on the floor. It did say that in the affidavit. So we know Maddie and Kaylee definitely in the twin bed. Xana on the floor. Ethan just in the room. We don't know whether he was in the bed or not. But we do have to consider staging a possibility. And that could be why this particular crime scene is so complex, in addition to the contamination. But that's about all I have for you today. I know that this was a lot of information and a lot of speculation and just kind of trying to make sense of the facts and also the non-facts in this case. I really care about this case, and if you're listening to this and following my coverage, you probably do too. So it really does upset me to see leaks and possibly not credible information being presented as fact. There's nothing wrong with speculating. Obviously, this is a true crime channel. That's what we do. But the
Justice for the Idaho Poor. Justice for Maddie. Justice for Kaylee, Xana, and Ethan.
problem is when it's being presented as fact, that's when the waters get muddied, and ultimately it's a huge disservice to the victims. I understand that these were real people, and my goal is to not indulge in the morbidly curious, gruesome speculation about these poor college kids' deaths. No, not at all. My purpose is to sort through the facts, help us understand how something like this could happen, and maybe get a little closer to the truth and ultimately justice for the victims. I hope this has given you a thing or two to think about, and please let me know about what your impressions of all of this are in the comments below, and I will see you in the next one.
She's right. It is a very complex case. And the crime scene was a very complex crime scene. I hope everyone had a wonderful Valentine's Day. I know I did. I want to thank all my wonderful mods. Pebbles, Bianca K, Ashley N, Sippa, and Sweet Surrender. And especially, I want to thank you, Rock Chalk. Like always, like, subscribe, comment, and share this channel. And if you're feeling frisky, why don't you hit that join button? For members only perks. Peace.
Thank you for tuning in to the True Crime Cult. The cult leader has left the building. Ha ha ha.